When you're ready to make a projection print in the darkroom, you're going to need some basic supplies from the cage. You're going to check out an easel, which this is a multiple size easel, most commonly used. You're going to need a blocker board for making your step test. You'll need a lens, and there's also a couple other things that you should consider checking out. One of which is a grain focuser, which will allow you to ensure the sharpest focus that you can, and some contrast filters, which will range from a -1 up to a 5. So I like to start out with these. Be very careful how you stack these, so I'm going to put all the flat stuff together first, the lens, and if necessary, I may even come back for something, okay? But these are the basic supplies. So when you make a print using the multiple sized easel like this, all of those prints will have a white border around the image area. Now this is nice because it allows you to use the smallest size piece of paper to make your print, and it leaves you a border that allows you to handle the print without touching the image area. Also, if you're using a standardized print size like the 5x7 with a white border, then you're going to put a white mat. So when working with standard size prints, you'll want to go ahead and mat those up because they're not going to show very nice with the outer edge border. One of the interesting things about photography is it's this two-dimensional media that we have artificially created a rectangle frame around the world. And so if you are making a print where the composition just won't fit a standard 5x7, 8x10 proportion, you're going to want to make your own proportion. And so using a bladed easel allows you to adjust the proportion of your image to whatever works best for you. And again, I'm a strong advocate of that, but you'll need to follow that up with cutting a custom mat as opposed to buying a store-bought ready-made mat at a standard print size. My personal favorite kind of easel to work with is a combination. It's actually, instead of 2 blades, it is a 4-bladed easel. And what I like about this, I use this for my exhibition prints because it allows me to create nice clean edges around the image, and it allows that image to automatically be centered onto the overall paper that I've printed on. So I've got a nice clean portfolio presentation. Whether I present it in a mat or present it plain, it just cleans up the presentation to have the 4-bladed cutout. When you're working in the darkroom, you may have a print that has some special need for dodge and burn. We also have a dodge tool, which is a little paddle that's got some serrated edges, and we can make custom dodge tools. These are really just kind of like coat hangers with a piece of cardboard attached to it. And burning tools, which are just simply little pieces of mat board with different size openings to it. And the key there being that you can move it around and custom burn in on your print. So these are some supplies that are available in the cage. Some other supplies that we sometimes have on hand, but actually you should get your own, would be a can of air to blow off dust off your negatives. And also it's great to have a hand towel with you because we don't want to use any paper towels in the darkroom. So I routinely will take a hand towel and stick it in the back pocket. When checking out darkroom supplies, you come to the cage and you fill out the checkout sheet. You need to understand something when checking out darkroom equipment. Staff are not going to give you thingamabobs or that thingy. You need to know the proper terminology in order to check out the piece of equipment needed to do the job. So, again, to review, there is a clipboard that you will sign your name. When you get the lens, the lab tech will tell you that you have a lens number. In this case, we have lens 28B, and all the other materials. In an ideal world, when you're working in the darkroom, you would have a metal negative carrier that would open up and it would have these little metal rivets here that help seat it into the enlarger correctly and makes everything in pristine order. But the reality is this is a school environment and we're working with some pretty old equipment, and over the years things have happened and things disappear, and the one thing that seems to go is the negative carriers seem to walk away. And so we have a limited number of metal negative carriers, and we've supplemented that with some neg carriers made out of mat board. And these are just a simple, you can see that people leave tape in there, and I'll show you why that is in just a little bit. Negative carriers made out of mat board work just fine, and in fact, if you want to make something a little fancier, we actually have the pattern for you to be able to make your own. And so you can see that this actually was cut out of this pattern. So you're welcome to cut your own and make it as nice as you would like. I'd be happy to see you do that. But just wanted to let you know not to be surprised if you end up going to check out a neg carrier, and instead of getting a metal negative carrier, you end up with a negative carrier made out of mat board. The next step in the printing process is to insert our negatives into the carrier that goes into the enlarger. So to do that, I've got my negatives here, I've got a negative carrier here, and I have something else, which is I have a tape dispenser, and I'll be showing you why we have that in just a moment. And then I have a can of air to be able to blow off dust. To begin with, we want to make sure that we can read the lettering and the numbers properly on our negative. And so we put the negative, what's known as right read emulsion, down. As you can see, I am not touching any of the image area of the negative. I want to handle the negative with just touching the outer edges. And what we're looking at here is we want to be able to read the letters and the numbers on the edge of the film strip. And so when you can read it, we know the emulsion is down. We call this right read emulsion down. The emulsion is actually, if I hold this here, you'll see that the top of the negative is really shiny, and if I flip this over, if the emulsion is up, you'll see it's slightly duller and the lettering is backwards. We always want to set it up right read emulsion down. So on this particular negative carrier, I'm just going to slide it across gently. And here's where we get the tape in. I'm going to just line that up in here, and I'm holding it in position with just 2 fingers on the outer edge, not touching any of the actual negative image area. And I'm going to grab a small piece of tape, masking tape, or in this case I'm using an acid-free artist tape that's easily removable. And I'm going to tape one edge down. And the reason I'm taping that edge down is so that when I flatten the negative carrier out and I lift it up, I'm not going to be worried about if I'm going to blow any air to blow off any dust, that I'm going to actually run the risk of the negative blowing out of the negative carrier. So the reason I put a little tape along the edge of the negative is it allows me to blow dust off. Now let's talk about dust a little bit in more detail. So I have a can of air. Now if you're using, some people use an air compressor and you have to worry about oil being blown out of that, so I actually prefer using a can of air over an air compressor. But with any canned air, there could be some condensation that will come out of the straw, and so I want to go ahead and give a couple of quick bursts. I never want to turn the can upside down and blow it, and I never want to blow directly onto the negative as well. So I'm always getting all the moisture out to begin with, and then I never blow straight at the negative. All I'm going to do is blow that dust into the negative and potentially scratch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow just short puffs of air to blow off any dust before I put it into the enlarger. And you'll see me when we get into the darkroom, I actually have the can of air at the enlarger, and I will look under the enlarger light and blow the dust off of the negative. So a little extra tip when loading your negatives. If I'm making a print that is going to be vertical, the negative is always going to be sideways and there's no adjustment to be made. However, if I'm doing a horizontal image, that image will be upside down when projected from the enlarger. So a little tip I want to give you right now is to actually insert your negative rotated 180 degrees, so it's still right read emulsion down, but now it appears upside down to me. So this is the negative we're going to print, upside down, and that way when it projects it'll be right side up towards me, which makes it a little easier for me to see. Now I'm going to grab a piece of tape and I'm going to tape the edge, not touching any of the image area, and here I'm using some acid-free tape that easily removes. You can use masking tape. We're not too worried about it because we're not touching any of the image area. And the reason we do that is to be able to hold that negative in place so that when I close this up, I don't have to worry about the negative sliding out if I'm blowing air to blow dust off of it. And then it just kind of helps keep everything secure. The other thing I want to point out with using the tape in here is that I'm not taping the top and the bottom of the strip. I'm only taping the top of the strip so that when I fold this over, it will flatten out flatter than what it is possible. If I were to tape that bottom edge, I would actually create a little buckling that could actually compromise image sharpness when I go to focus the negative. The next thing we're going to talk about before we go into the darkroom is some of the things that we need that help make the image. The first thing is we're going to talk about enlarger lenses, and I have 3 enlarger lenses here that are at different focal lengths. And so you'll notice something about the focal lengths in that they correspond with what are the normal lenses for the film formats that we're photographing with. So for example, if I were making a print, a projected print from 35mm negative, I'm going to use a 50mm lens, and in this case I have a Nikkor 50mm lens, and it has aperture controls just like the standard aperture settings on your camera. So this, whether we're in the darkroom or out in the field with our camera, photography still is dealing with the aperture, the time, and the sensitivity of the ISO of the, in this case, the paper in the darkroom. We have a 50mm lens that works with a 35mm negative. With our 2 1/4, we're using either a 75 or an 80mm lens. Slightly longer is advantageous for what we call the coverage of the negative with the light. It gives a more even light quality edge to edge on the print, so having a slightly larger focal length works reasonably well. And so we use an 80mm lens for medium format, and so here is a 120 6x7 negative that would work quite well. And if I were shooting with a medium format Hasselblad, I'd be using an 80mm as a normal lens. With the 4x5 negative size, we're actually using a longer focal length lens, and this is a 135mm lens, which is slightly on the shorter end of 4x5, but certainly within the limitations of working. But we typically see 135 to 150mm as the most common lenses that we work with. Here at the college, we have a darkroom that has 2 different kinds of enlargers. The first kind that we work with are the Bessler enlargers, and these are the square lens boards that you will work with to put into the Bessler enlargers. The other type, which is also a nice array to look at, is with the dichroic head enlargers we have. The dichroic head enlargers that we have in there, those are originally designed to make color prints, and they have a color mixing chamber with built-in color filters for cyan, yellow, magenta. But they also make excellent enlargers for black and white photography because we can use those yellow and magenta filters to control contrast on our variable contrast papers. So this is a turret lens array where we have 3 different focal length lenses on a single turret, and we can rotate to our different focal lengths. So this has a 135 millimeter lens on it, a 70 or 80 millimeter lens on it, and then it has the 50 millimeter lens. And you'll see as we get into the darkroom, the reason we need also to use a smaller focal length for a smaller negative is it has to do with the angle of the light to be able to make enlargements. And so a 35 millimeter negative, here's a small 35 millimeter negative. In order to enlarge to an 8 by 10, we would have to raise that way up. But if we use a slightly shorter lens, we can get that wider angle to make a large projection print without having to raise it so far that the intensity of light falls off too fast. Again, with the medium format, it's a larger negative. And so in order to raise that up to make an 8 by 10, we don't have to take it as far, and so we can use a longer focal length lens for that. And then finally, we get to our 4 by 5. And a 4 by 5, by comparison to a 35 millimeter, only has to be magnified twice to get up to an 8 by 10 inch print, which is a pretty standard size on there. So we have a long focal length lens that gives us excellent edge-to-edge cover, but we don't need to raise it up and down very far before we get very large print sizes. So a 4 by 5 raised up and magnified twice is an 8 by 10, magnified twice again is a 1620, very short distance, whereas 35 millimeter, look how small this is, right? It's about a 1 inch, and so it has to be magnified 9 times just to make an 8 inch by 10 inch print. And then to go up to a 16 by 20, it'd have to be way up high in order to do that. So that's some of the reasons why we use different focal length lenses in the Enlarger. So just to review the different formats, we have 35 millimeter, which is 24 millimeters by 36 millimeters, about a 1 inch long negative. 2 1/4, in this case a 2 1/4, 3 1/4 inch rectangle film format. And then we have 4 by 5, which is the beginning of the large format camera format. So as you can see, there's a huge difference in the size of the original negatives we work with in the darkroom. When you come into the darkroom, my recommendation is you take your paper and you put it in one of the drawers that is underneath the Enlarger. There's generally 2 drawers underneath each Enlarger. Also, I will cut up some test strips and put them in a drawer face down and cover them up as well. If you have a book bag that happens to be too large for your locker for any particular reason, you also have the access to cabinets underneath here that you can store that while you're working in the darkroom. We don't want to spread out too much on the tabletops. That counter space is really valuable, and we have to be able to work well with our neighbors. The first thing we do when coming into the darkroom with our supplies is we need to put the lens in the Enlarger. This is absolutely critical before turning on the Enlarger, because what will happen is we will have a flood of light that will fog your neighbor's paper. So we never ever ever turn on the Enlarger without a lens in the Enlarger. So I'm going to demonstrate how to put a lens in the Enlarger, and with these Bessler condenser head enlargers, they have a square lens board that the lens is mounted to. We have our standard aperture ring with our apertures here, so we generally want to see those numbers, right? And what we're going to do is, it's a one-hand operation. I know that there's going to be a problem if I see somebody working this lens board with 2 hands, because you're probably going to force something that's not meant to be forced. It's a one-hand operation, and I've found from experience it just happens smoothly. So you'll see I take my thumb and my index finger, wrap it around the barrel of the lens, careful not to touch the front lens element and put fingerprints on that. That would certainly ruin some of the image quality. So I have my thumb and index finger around the barrel of the lens, careful not to touch the front element of the lens. And all I'm doing is I'm going to take the flat end, push it up into the opening, and there's a spring back there. And all I'm going to do is push against that spring far enough to allow me to lift the front edge up far enough, and then let it slide forward. The spring will push it forward over the lip of the opening, which is allowing the lens to stay in place. And so I can remove my hand. Okay. Now, when you first practice doing this, and I emphasize the word practice, I want you to take the lens in and out a couple of times so that you get comfortable with how much pressure. I'm just pushing back, pulling down, and I'm just going to push against the back, lift, pivot up, and let it come back into position. Again, take the hand away. Let's do it again. I'm going to push against the back, tilt down, bring the lens out, and I'm going to reverse the operation to put the lens in. I'm going to push up against the back spring, and I'm tilt that up and let the spring push it over the lip and make sure it's secure. Don't let go without making sure everything's seated properly. Now that the lens is properly seated in the enlarger, there's one other factor we need to take into consideration. These enlargers are capable of enlarging negatives from 35mm to 2 1/4 square to 4" by 5" negatives. And so, depending on the format of film that I'm putting into the enlarger, I need to adjust the top bellows of the enlarger to adjust the distance of the light source to the negative to ensure that we aren't getting any vignetting on our negative, meaning that there's light falling off at the corners of the image to where it actually comes out lighter on the print. So what we're going to do is take a look here. On this particular enlarger, we actually have a gauge that we can see, and I'm going to, for 35mm, drop this all the way down to the 35mm mark. Okay. Now, what I like to do is just kind of see roughly that's about the distance of my thumb if I set it here up to my middle finger. And this is important to make note of, because if I'm at an enlarger that doesn't have that gauge, I want to be able to know I can go to a different enlarger and just adjust that and know that's 35mm. If I were doing 2 1/4, that would be at this distance, and that would be probably my fist. So that's about that. And then if I'm doing 4 by 5, that's the one that's closest, because the negative's so large we have to get the light source, that's as big as that light source can go, and you can see that it's pretty much all the way to the top. So those are the 3 most common settings of the top bellows here before we start projecting our negative. Since we're printing a 35mm, I'm going to back it down to the 35mm mark on the gauge. I'm going to bring this secondary bellows is for focusing, up and down rack focus on here. And there's something else that I want to point out with these enlargers, and that is we have a focus lock that sometimes people put on, and people start really working rough on that. What we want to do is, this is our focus. To begin our work in the darkroom, we need to understand how to operate the timers that are attached to the enlargers. Before we begin, we have to make sure we have a lens properly seated in the enlarger, that everything's closed up here, here, and there's a lens in here. I'm going to be working with one of the timers that's pretty common in darkrooms today, and that is the Graylab 450 electronic timer. On this Graylab timer, we have a start button, which is really a bar. That's the big button here. And so if I turn a time on, we'll just hit the button and it starts it. On the bottom right, just above the start bar, is our outlet time and our outlet focus light, and that turns the enlarger on in order to focus our negative. When we're done focusing, we push the outlet time button and it's ready to do our time. On the left-hand side, just above the start bar, I'll add just 5 seconds to work with to begin with. We have 3 settings here based on the alarms or tone sounds that the timer will make. If I set it to the tone option, which is the 3rd button from the left, it will set off an alarm when it's reached the end of the exposure time. If I click on the middle button, which is metronome, it will actually count off each second. This can be helpful when doing dodge and burn technique, but again, we don't want to do this in a group enlarger room where we have up to 20 enlargers going at the same time. But if you're working alone, you could have the metronome on and it will count off each second. In general, we want to turn all the sounds off, and that is the bottom left button just above the start bar. So when I'm first starting out any darkroom printing session, I'm going to make sure that I have the outlet time and focus, understand where that is, and make sure that I set the sounds off. I'm going to turn off the enlarger, and notice that when I turn it back on for another printing session at another time, the default setting is for that tone setting. And so the first time you turn on the timer, it's going to make that loud sound, and that's going to be really annoying for all the people working around you. So we're going to turn that off right away. We have two options when it comes to setting time. On the just above the dials to the left, we have full seconds or tenth of a second. When the timer is set to full seconds, the right-hand dial will be 1 second increments, and the left-hand dial will be 10-second increments. So I can get a very long exposure time. I can go all the way up to 90, looks like 98 seconds. With that left-hand dial being at 10 seconds, I can get up to just about 100 seconds on one exposure. Now I can't imagine actually using that long of exposure. Most of my exposure times are going to be in the 20 to 30 second range, because that gives me plenty of time for doing a typical dodge burn, as we'll talk about at another time. So if I need really precise timing, then I can actually go to a tenth of a second and do really fine detail work, which is why this Graylab timer is so popular among darkroom users. To be honest with you, I virtually never do tenth of a second times because I really don't want to use an exposure time shorter than 10 seconds for any print in the darkroom. So for me, I like to have a 20-second time so that each 1 second increment is only changing my exposure value by a 5% factor. If I had it at 10 seconds, each 1 second exposure change would be a 10% change in exposure. So I'm plenty happy to work with 20 to 30 seconds and whole second increments for most of my work. On the upper right, we simply have options for how bright the display is. I can turn it to a dim mode, or I can turn the display off. And again, I can't imagine not wanting to have the display on so I can see what I'm setting my time to, particularly in a dark room. So in general, I like to leave it set to the high display so that it's nice and easy to read even from a distance. In order to operate the darkroom enlarger, like I said, we have to have the timer set on, and then we have to turn the outlet focus on, and we have our enlarger turned on. At this point, I can now raise and lower the enlarger. There's a power drive on the right that just has a lever that if I push it up, it goes up. If I push it down, it goes down. So this is how I will get my image projected at the right size, and then I'll adjust my focus. This is the Time-A-Light. It's a classic darkroom timer. It's been around forever. The focus light is just when you push the lever down, it's in focus, and when you turn it up, it's off, but it's ready to work in timer mode. We just rotate the dial to the number of seconds we want. We push the button, and the enlarger comes on, and the red hand goes to 0, and then it resets itself. This is a classic rotary face where you just turn the dial and to whatever seconds you want, push the button, the enlarger comes on, and you wait as the red hand goes back to 0. Now when working with a Time-O-Lite, if I'm doing test strips to where I am doing multiple short exposures, I may find that if I decide that I want a 14-second exposure with the Time-O-Lites, if I set it to 14, that may in fact be slightly shorter than if I had pushed the timer for 2 seconds 7 times. So you have to be aware that you might have to fluctuate just slightly on overall exposure because they're a mechanical device and they're not quite as accurate as a digital timer, but they work just great, so I highly recommend them. One of the things I love about Time-O-Lites is they've been so indestructible and have lasted forever. So if you can get a hold of one for your darkroom, I highly recommend it. When you have your Enlarger set up with the top bellows distance correct, the lens inserted into it, the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to put our negative carrier into the Enlarger. So there's a knob on the side here, and that lowers that front bellows so that you can insert your negative carrier. We never put the negative carrier in with the Enlarger turned on because that light can fog our neighbor's paper. So I want to make sure the Enlarger is turned off, and then I'm going to pull down the top bellows and slide the negative carrier in. If I'm using a cardboard carrier where I don't have a nice seated position, I will then go ahead and turn on the Enlarger with this all sealed up, and I can just move that around just ever so slightly to make sure I'm getting my negative in the center of the frame. We're now ready to focus our negative image, and so I'm going to turn the Enlarger on, and the first thing I want you to know is I'm going to go to the lens and open up the aperture all the way. I always focus with the Enlarger all the way open. Okay. Now something else I'm going to tell you is I never throw away bad prints because I can use a scrap print and put that paper in there, and that white paper will allow me to see my image a little brighter, and it's going to account for the thickness of the paper so that I'm not dependent upon depth of field to create the sharpest image on that paper I'm working with. So I like to have it a sheet of paper in the easel so I can focus on that, and then I'm going to enlarge to fill the frame. Just keep enlarging, and this is where you find out that an image is made multiple times. First it's made in the camera when you compose your image, and then it gets remade and recomposed in the darkroom under the Enlarger as we set it up in the easel. So this would be how I would focus for a 8x10, and in fact I'm going to bring in a grain focuser. And to use a grain focuser, I'm not looking at the image information. I'm going to set the grain focuser in the middle of the frame so it's getting the most direct light down to it. And what I'm going to do is bring my eye up to it, and I don't want to lay my head on the grain focuser. I actually just need to see a full frame depending on the style of grain focuser. In this case, I'm just making a subtle adjustment to where I can see the actual particles of silver being focused, and I can't see any information on the image, but I can see the grain structure to know that that is the absolute sharpest I can get that image. Now that I have it focused, I will go ahead and stop it down, and I generally stop down 2 to 3 stops to where the lens is at its sharpest and where I know I'm going to have a low enough amount of light that I'm going to need a longer time exposure for my final print, because I like to have an exposure between 20 and 40 seconds ideally for an exhibition print. We've put the lens in the Enlarger. We've adjusted the top bellows height of the light source for our film format, and when it comes to focusing, we're using these bottom bellows with the focus guide here, and you'll see the kind of geared mechanism here. Now, some people accidentally lock and leave that focus locked, and that will cause people to really force that focus. If it's not moving smoothly, make sure the focus lock is loose because I will tell you that they don't move around a lot anyway. These enlargers don't have that fine a focus control to them. So I'm going to use a combination of turning on the outlet focus. So we have the enlarger on. I'm going to adjust the height of it, and then I'm going to adjust my critical focus. Okay, I'm going to focus my image, and here I'm actually using a multi 4-in-1 easel, and I'm going to make a 5x7. So I'm going to set this down, and I'm going to have to bring this enlarger, I'm going to open it up all the way to its brightest, and I'm going to, with the outlet timer turned on for focus, I can move the enlarger up and down. And I won't move it all the way down because I know when I refocus it'll shrink up a little bit more. So I just start working my way down. And now I'll bring in, that's about where I want it to be. I'll probably go just a little bit smaller. This is pretty close to a nice full frame image. And now I'm going to use the grain focuser. And I'll put the grain focuser, and actually before I do that, I'm going to turn that off for a moment. I'm going to tell you, don't leave your enlarger on for too long a period of time. The heat produced by the bulb could cause the negative to buckle, which will impact the sharpness of the image. So we don't want to do that. So don't leave it on for 2-3 minutes. We only need it long enough for our exposure. I'm actually going to put an old piece of paper in here that's photographic paper, and I'll focus on the back of it. And what that's going to do is account for, of course we get a really curvy one, by putting a piece of used paper just upside down on it so I can focus on the image. What that's doing is accounting for the thickness of that paper, so I'm getting the absolute sharpest image possible. And now I'm going to put the grain focuser in here towards the middle of the frame. And again, I'm not bringing my eye all the way to it. I'm just bringing it close enough to see that grain structure, and I know that that image is as sharp as I can get it. Once I have my image focused, I'm going to stop the lens down. We always focus with the lens wide open because it makes it easier to see, and then we go ahead and stop that lens down. And when I'm working on such a short distance, I may have to stop it down to f11, f16 on the enlarger lens so that I don't have such an intense bright light, which would cause my exposure time to be far shorter than I'd like. I want a minimum 10-second exposure time. Preferably 20 seconds would be my overall exposure time that I would like the most, because then any 1-second variation for dodging and burning is going to change the exposure value by only a 5% value, so we can work on some really fine details in our final print. So when I'm getting ready to do a test strip for a projection print, I want to turn on the enlarger for a moment and take a look. And what I'm looking for testing is, where are these dark areas of the negative, because those dark areas are going to be my highlights because they're blocking light on my paper. They'll have less exposure. What I'm looking for projection printing is very different than what I'm looking for a contact print. For contact print, I'm looking for maximum black on the unexposed edge. What I'm looking for in a projection print is the highlight areas, and so I'm going to look where that is, and I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to put that test strip right over that highlight area. And we talk about the mantra in photography, and particularly black and white film photography, is we expose for shadows and we print for highlights. Well, with contact prints, we are exposing for maximum edge black, but for projection prints, I'm actually looking at how much exposure I need to get texture in my brightest highlights that I want a little detail in. So that's why I'm going to set that test strip where those highlight values are, and I'll start working my way across with my blocker board. When I'm ready to process any photographic paper in the darkroom, I'm going to take a look at the clock on the wall that has the second hand. I'm going to pay attention to where that is, or if I'm wearing a watch with a dial that I can see a second hand moving, I'm going to take a look at that, and I'm just going to slide the paper in and take some tongs and just knock that in underneath the chemicals, and I'm just going to gently rock the tray. And the reason we're rocking the tray is the same reason we agitate when we're doing film processing. It's so we keep fresh chemicals in contact with the paper at all times during the processing. With developing paper, it's a little bit different in that the developer kind of reaches a maximum black, and any more time isn't going to add any more density. So we want to develop our prints to the maximum time so that we get consistent results from print to print. So you'll see the image start to come up. I never get tired of looking at the image coming up, but I want to point out that in a dark room the images should look dark. So don't worry about it if it seems like they're all too dark. I'm sure they're not. When we go out into the light to evaluate our test strip, you'll see that the images are much lighter than you think. We avoid using our hands in the chemistry as much as possible, and so we have the tongs, and what we're going to do when we're ready to pull the paper out, we're going to hold it up with the tongs, and we're going to let that paper drip. We're going to hold it at an angle so it wicks all the developer down to the corner and drip it out, because we don't want to overly contaminate the next tray and waste chemistry. So now we're going to move over to the stop bath tray, and I'll go ahead and just drop that in there and not tuck my tongs into that chemistry. I'll put that back. We don't creep the tongs from one tray to the next. We use the tongs that are with each tray, and I always like looking at the image, so I've got a habit of flipping them over so I can keep an eye on them. That's where the excitement comes from after all these years. I just love looking at prints in the tray. And with the stop bath, we have only a 15-second amount of time necessary. And then we can take that and hold it up at an angle to let it drip. And when we see it stop dripping significantly, we will move it over to the fixer tray. And we'll go ahead and drop that in, put our tongs back into the stop bath, and we will just go ahead and get the fixer rocking gently. The fixer time is 2 minutes. Our developer time is 1 minute and 30 seconds, and generally about a 10-second drain. Our stop bath is a 15-second time with a 10-second drain, and our fixer is a 2-minute fixing time with a 10-second drain. And we don't want to overfix our prints, so definitely try to keep that as close to 2 minutes as you can. Don't walk away from the darkroom and disappear and come back an hour later. It will affect the overall print quality. You'll notice that we have signs above the darkroom sink that give you the times for RC paper, and that's what we're working with for this particular contact print. I like to use RC paper for contact prints, test strips, and then if I'm doing an exhibition print, I'll switch to fiber, and those times will be significantly longer on the fixer and the wash time. The developer will be about the same, and the stop will be about the same, but the fixer and the wash will be quite a bit longer. Okay. So when I come out of the darkroom, I'm going to step aside from the opening of the doorway so that I can evaluate the work and not block the entrance to the darkroom. And I can see from this print here that I haven't gone quite dark enough. We've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and I probably need somewhere a little beyond that to get the highlights where I want them to be. So what we want to do with any test strip is we want to have a time that's too light and a time that's too dark so that we know how to gauge what the accurate time will be for our printing time. So since the 18-second time was still not quite enough. I'm actually going to set up a base exposure of 10 seconds. I'm going to set my test strip here, and I'm going to, in looking at the original test strip, I think the image could use a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to actually add a number 3 filter, which is a good starting point for contrast control. So I'm going to go into our contrast filters and get to the page that has the number 3 filter, and I'll pull that out. Since we're going to be printing with variable contrast paper, we are going to be working with contrast filters, and so I've grabbed one that is easy to see. There are 2 ways we can use contrast filters with the Enlarger. The first way would be to simply put it over the lens and change the color light that's exposing the paper. However, that's not very advisable because this is not an optically sound filter. This is actually just a piece of polyester that's color. It's flexible, it gets scratched easily, it's not optically sound. So where we actually put this kind of filter is we want to change the color of the light source before it goes through the lens, because the lens is what's going to focus the image, as opposed to putting it below the lens where the light's having to be focused through a optically inferior light source. We put contrast filters generally above the negative so that we're simply changing the color of the light source and not focusing through the contrast filter. So there's a shelf in here that we just lift this up. Now I'm leaving the Enlarger on so you can see this, but you do not ever do this in practice in the darkroom. But for right now I'm just going to show you that the filter just slides in to the filter tray, and that will change the color of the light source. Okay? And you want to put it in just far enough to where it feels like it's going to fall in, so that you're getting coverage across the whole negative. The second way we can use filters is if we were doing a contrast control on the print after we've made our basic exposure. We've made our base exposure with the filter above the lens. That's going to control the overall sharpness of the image, and now I'm not worrying about adding a whole lot of sharpness, but rather controlling the contrast within a localized area. So in that case, I will do a dodge burn effect with just a filter over the lens to change the color in that area, and that's fine for that. Up above, just like we showed you. And now I'm going to do a 10-second base exposure of the entire test strip. And because I know I'm going to get pretty close there when I get around 20 seconds, I'm probably going to go ahead and just change this to a 2-second increment. Now remember how we talked about I use larger increments for the first test strip, and then I narrow it down a little bit. So I'm going to go with 2-second increments. And I'm going to do some pretty small step wedges, so about ½ an inch each, and I'm just going to remember how far I'm going each time. And in this case, we did 10 seconds, and I'm doing 2 seconds each. I know I need at least 20 seconds, so I need at least 5 increments, and that's why I'm going in pretty small progression here, so I can get plenty of times to check. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit this the last time, which will add the least amount of time will be 12 seconds, and I'm actually going to hit it a second time to get up to 14 seconds, because we knew 14 seconds wasn't dark enough. But that way I'm going to have a range from 14 to well over 20 seconds to look at. And I'm also taking into consideration that by adding a filter when there wasn't one before, that's going to block some of that light, and so the time's going to extend out a little bit longer. I'm watching the second hand on the clock, and I'm going to go ahead and put the test strip in the developer, and I'm going to process it for 1 minute and 30 seconds. So when I'm done processing, I will pick up the test strip with tongs. I don't want to use my fingers in the developer, and I'll let it drain at a 45-degree angle so it wicks down to the corner and just drains. And we'll go ahead and just let that sit there for about 10 seconds. When processing prints, we're not worried about developing too long because it kind of reaches a maximum. That's where that minute and a half, I always want to develop at least a minute and a half, because beyond that, not much is happening with the paper. So in order to get consistent print density from one print to the other, I want to use the maximum printing time to ensure that I'm always going to get the same density on the print. Now I'm going to not drop the tongs into the stop bath. I'm going to set the print in there, and it doesn't matter if it's upside down or not. It just is going to rock gently in there. The excitement of watching the print come up is in the developer tray, so I'm not too worried about it, looking at the image in the stop bath. And that's just a 15-second, just a quick neutralizing of the developer, and we'll let that drain, and we'll move over to the fix. What's fun about watching the print and the fix is it'll just kind of snap up and contrast a little bit as the unexposed silver is removed from the paper. We only need to fix RC paper for 2 minutes, so it's a pretty short time. If it's a test strip like this, I don't worry about the whole 2 minutes because it's just an initial test, and I can bring it back to the fixer if I need to, if I want to keep it. But I'm just going to leave it in there for a minute, minute and a half. For my final prints, I definitely want to fix for the whole time. But now I'm going to go ahead and put it in. We have 2 trays for washing, and I'm going to put it in the first smaller tray. And in general, it's a good habit to put it in the first initial wash bath before putting in the large one, because we don't want to contaminate any student's work that's in, we don't want to contaminate anybody else's prints that are washing in the final wash bath by adding something fresh from the fixer into it. So we'll go ahead and put it into the first tray. And really, for a test strip, that's all I need to do. And then I'm going to go around and get a tray to put it in. So I'm not worried about picking up the print once it's in the wash. And if you do happen to get any of the chemicals on your hands, you'll notice the sink is filled with running water. Just rinse off your hand and wipe it off on the towel that you should have a hand towel in your back pocket available to dry off your hands at any time. So we'll take this out into the hallway and evaluate it. We've got our next test strip, and we've added a number 3 filter to it. And I'm still not seeing anything that looks too dark on the leaf, but I do see that way back here, the tree trunk looks like it could have some interesting texture at the lighter values. So at this next step, I'm actually going to do 2 different tests at 2 different areas within the image so I can control how much time each area receives to get the best print possible. So here we see our first test strip with no filter, and it looks a little flat, kind of muddy, and that's what we call low contrast. There's no rich blacks, plenty of highlight detail, but no blacks to really pop out those highlights. What we're looking for is that contrast of lights and dark values. Here we added the number 3 filter, and you can see there, even though this is lighter than up here, it's got more snap to it. You see the blacks going a little blacker, but there wasn't enough time there. And so here we have our tree trunk, which has great texture in it. It's got great shadow detail in here. There's great shadow detail back here. But the leaves look a little light. So now if we look down here at the leaves, here's getting too dark. Here's looking really, really nice in here. And there's back close to what's up above where it's just a little bit lighter. So I kind of like what's going on at this time here. So that's going to be a 22, 24, 26 seconds for that, 20 seconds for that. So we have a 6-second difference between what I want the leaves to print at versus the tree trunk area itself. So we're going to talk about how to handle that. I'm going to use a dodging technique. What I'm going to do is I'm going to print for the leaves, print for the highlights, and hold back the time on the tree trunk for that difference. Okay, so we'll have a 6-second dodge on the final print. I've got a piece of paper, and I'm going to set it into my easel area carefully without moving anything. And I've got a 5x8 sheet of paper, and I'm only making a 5x7 print. That extra paper is going to give me plenty of area to handle the print without damaging any of the print area. So that's one reason I do that. So now I'm going to go ahead and expose. I'm going to go ahead and let it get a good start on that exposure, because I can do my dodge at any time. And I'll just start dodging at the 10 seconds and stop at the 4 seconds. So I'll just come in here, just constantly moving so there's no hard edge. And I'll pull it away for the end of the exposure. So I just dodged for 6 seconds on that tree trunk area. I'll pull that print out, and I know that I've got all this area that I can handle the paper without touching the image area. A little extra tip about printing in the darkroom with RC papers. If you've got good developer, you'll start to see the image appear within about 10 seconds. If I'm working with fiber paper, I generally won't expect to see any image form until about 30 to 40 seconds. So just a little extra tip on printing procedures. And that's looking just gorgeous. That's going to be nice. So now this is a final print, or at least I think it's going to be a final print, so I definitely want to watch my times, develop everything out for the full 1.5 minutes, stop for the full 15 seconds. I like to bring it close to me so I can watch it and develop a little bit, and we'll definitely fix it for the entire 2-minute time. Another nice thing about having a nice border around the image is it makes it so much easier for matting to be able to do a hinge mount on that border. And now the magic will happen in the fixer, where you'll just see the image just snap up a little bit. Also, don't shake your print trying to get it to drip any faster. I know we're excited. I know I get excited and it's very tempting, but you're not helping anything by shaking your print. Oh my goodness, look at that. Those leaves just pop now. I can tell you this is a nice print, but we're actually going to take it a step further. So we're going to really do it up for the final print, and I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. So we'll go ahead and leave that in the fixer for the full time, and we'll come back and check on it in a few minutes. So for the final print, I'm actually going to burn in the bottom left corner, but to begin with, I'm going to dodge my tree back area. And now I'm going to take my blocker board and cover the entire image, and I'm actually going to print for the entire additional, a second push of the button, and go ahead and just burn in up to those leaves. It's a one-stop burn, essentially. And historically, great printers would always burn in their corners to keep the eye from wandering out of the frame. And there's just so much texture and busyness on that bottom of the frame that we want to just go ahead and pull the eye up to those leaves. So when we're done with our wash, we're going to come into the print finishing room to squeegee off the excess water and put it in the drying rack. So we have two sizes of squeegee that we work with. For large prints, we have a large squeegee, and for most prints, we use a smaller squeegee here. I'm going to go ahead and lay the print. I usually start face down on a piece of glass here, and I'm maintaining my fingers underneath the edge of it, and I'll squeegee off the back, and then I'll squeegee the glass off, and then I will squeegee off the front of the print. And now I'll put the squeegee back where it belongs, and I will open up the print drying rack, and I'm just going to look for a tray number that doesn't have too many prints already in it. So here's one I can go ahead and fit my print in, and I'll just remember that it's in tray 3. Remember how I said it was nice to have a little extra paper on one end of it? Makes it really nice for this larger 5x7 print to be able to squeegee it off, and we don't want to laminate the print to the glass. So if I put it all the way flat and squeegee it off, it's going to be very hard to peel up without getting a razor blade. So I'm going to hold the top edge of it, squeegee the glass underneath, wipe it on the towel that's next to the glass, and I'll squeegee off the front of the print, put the squeegee back, and now I've got most of the water off, and we can go into the drying rack. And I'm just going to pull out a tray that looks pretty empty here, and this is tray 6, so I'll go ahead and set my print face up on the drying rack. So we always put them face up on there, and we want to squeegee them off so that the prints underneath aren't going to have any water drops on them. And that'll be dry in about 15 minutes. I think we have a couple really nice final prints that we've made with this 4-in-1 easel. Whenever I think I have something that's truly portfolio worthy, then I will actually switch out from the 4-in-1 easel to a 4-bladed easel. And this doesn't happen that often because it takes a lot of good prints to get to a great print. And so I'm going to go ahead and recompose my image. I'm not going to change the aperture unless I absolutely have to. I'll bring in my grain focuser to check focus. And with the grain focuser, I'm actually in pretty good shape of seeing the focus even under the dimmer light. And my goal here is to hopefully, by not changing the enlarger height, I should be able to make the same basic exposure as all my other tests. And I think I'm going to just punch that down just a little bit further, and we'll go ahead and get a piece of paper. And what's nice about this easel is I can open it up and line up my paper, and I'll go ahead and make my base exposure. Go ahead and make my base exposure. Dodging my tree area again. Doing my foreground burn. And we'll go ahead and process. So larger print, 8x10 sheet of paper, do the back, squeegee the glass, wipe off the squeegee, do the front, put the squeegee back, open up the tray, and go back to the last tray I used, number 6, and set that in there. And we're done. When you're returning your darkroom supplies, you will return them by setting them on this countertop and by scratching your name out with a strike-through line that indicates that you return it. Make sure you're returning it to somebody who's actually working in the cage or an instructor. We're ready to finish up this whole printing process and get this print ready for display. So I've got a 5x7 window mat. I went ahead and just pre-purchased one that's pre-cut, and then I have an 8x10 mat as well underneath here. So to begin with, I'm going to make a hinge by using some acid-free artist tape, and I'm just going to hinge these the front and back of the mat together. This is kind of a non-destructive method of presenting your work, and it's getting it ready to go into a frame. But it's something that can be easily reversed at any time. And if we see any discoloration of the matting at a future date, it's easy to replace it with a fresh mat before it ever damages the print. So that's the advantage of matting a print, is that it's giving us some protection to our print. And then if we need to down the road because of some sort of pollution, we can always change out the mat before it gets to our image. So I've got this set up. I'm going to just fold this down here, take a look at it. And it looks pretty good. And so now I'm going to slide the print in. Remember, I have this extra border around there. It makes it easy to handle. And I'm just going to line this up in here. And in my home studio, I have a nice glass paperweight that I can use at this point. In this case, I'm just going to use my cell phone and set that gently on top of the image, flip the mat out of the way, and I've got a couple choices. I'll be a little formal about it. The easiest method for making what we call a hinge mount is to simply tuck a little bit of tape underneath the print and then tape across that with another piece to hold it in place on our mat. We'll leave some of the sticky parts showing because that'll help keep the mat together when we fold it back over. And I'm going to go ahead and do that a second time, just break this into 2 little pieces. And I don't want to go very far, I just want to go to where the print image area, I don't want to go into the print image area, I just want to go to that border area. And I'll just tape that across there, and I'll just double check that everything stayed in position, looks good. And I'll go ahead and just beef that up just a little bit more with a little longer piece. And now we fold that up and we have our print all matted, ready to go. The last thing to do is to sign our mat. So I like to sign in pencil rather than ink pen because I think the blackness of an ink pen competes for attention with my photograph, and so I generally sign with a number 2 pencil. Here's our final print, and we've gone through the complete step-by-step for doing a projection print in the darkroom, and I look forward to seeing you there soon.